The unshakable resolve. The airport pulsed with its usual rhythm. Announcements echoing overhead, hurried footsteps clattering against polished tiles, and the subdued murmur of voices blending into a chaotic harmony. Naomi Bennett, a black businesswoman dressed in a tailored navy blazer and sleek heels, moved through the terminal with a quiet confidence that turned heads. Her briefcase swung lightly at her side, and her determined expression made her purpose clear. This was just another day in her world of high-stakes negotiations and boardroom battles. Naomi had worked tirelessly to reach this point. Her journey had not been easy, filled with moments where she had to prove she deserved a seat at the table, even when the odds were stacked against her. But now, she was on the brink of closing the multi-million-dollar deal that could redefine her career. She was no stranger to pressure, but today felt different, charged, almost as if the air around her crackled with unseen tension. At the gate, the boarding process for the first-class cabin began. Naomi handed her ticket to the attendant, a woman with a practiced smile. The smile faltered momentarily when she glanced at Naomi, her eyes flickering between the ticket and Naomi's face. It was subtle, but Naomi noticed. She always noticed. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett," the attendant said, her tone overly polite, as if trying to mask her initial hesitation. Naomi responded with a gracious nod and moved down the jet bridge, her heels clicking steadily on the metal surface. As Naomi stepped onto the plane, the ambience of first class greeted her. Plush seats, ambient lighting, and an air of exclusivity that came with the steep price of admission. She found her seat, 1A, a spacious corner with a view of the tarmac. Settling in, she adjusted her silk scarf and opened her leather-bound notebook to review her notes for the upcoming meeting. The cabin filled gradually, passengers nodding politely to one another. Naomi caught snippets of conversations: a man in a tailored suit discussing stock options, a woman in pearls gushing over her latest vacation in the Maldives. Naomi tuned it all out, focusing on her work. She had learned long ago how to occupy these spaces without allowing them to occupy her. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform emerged from the cockpit. The pilot, Captain Reynolds, scanned the cabin with a sweeping gaze that exuded authority. Naomi barely registered him as she jotted notes in her notebook, but then his gaze stopped on her. It lingered. Naomi sensed it immediately. That silent scrutiny she had endured countless times. She looked up, her eyes meeting his without flinching. Captain Reynolds hesitated, his face a mask of professionalism, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Naomi's steady gaze didn't waver. The captain approached her, his steps measured but deliberate. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a faint edge. "May I see your boarding pass?" Naomi blinked, surprised by the question. "I've already shown it to the attendant," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "It's standard procedure," he insisted. Naomi reached into her bag and retrieved the ticket, handing it to him with measured composure. The captain inspected it closely, his brow furrowing, as if he expected to find an error. When he found none, he returned it with a tight nod. "Thank you," he said, but the suspicion in his tone remained. The exchange had drawn the attention of nearby passengers. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin like a low hum. Naomi felt the weight of their stares, but refused to let it show. She held her head high and resumed reviewing her notes as if nothing had happened. The flight attendant reappeared moments later, offering Naomi a strained smile. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. "No, thank you," Naomi replied, her tone polite but clipped. The attendant lingered a moment before retreating, clearly unsure of how to navigate the tension. Minutes passed, and the murmurs grew louder. Naomi kept her focus on her notebook, but her calm exterior belied the growing frustration inside her. This wasn't the first time she had been singled out, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But she wasn't about to let this derail her day, or her dignity. The hum of the engines signaled the impending departure, but the plane didn't move. Naomi glanced at her watch. The flight was already delayed by 7 minutes. She could feel the tension in the air thickening, like a storm about to break. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit again, his face set in a grim expression. This time, he didn't just scan the cabin. He walked directly to Naomi's row. "Ma'am," he began, his voice quieter but no less firm, "I need to ask you to step off the plane." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Naomi felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. "May I ask why?" she said evenly. "It's a matter of security," the captain replied, his gaze unwavering. Naomi's eyes narrowed. What security concern could possibly involve me sitting in my assigned seat? The captain hesitated, and in that moment, Naomi saw it, the unspoken bias that had driven his actions. This wasn't about security. It was about her. Her presence in this space was being questioned, not because of any valid reason, but because of assumptions that had nothing to do with her credentials or character. "I'm not leaving this plane," Naomi said, her voice steady and resolute. "If you have a legitimate concern, I suggest you address it with the proper authorities." The captain's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I must insist." "And I must insist you call your supervisor," Naomi interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut through the murmurs around her. "I will not be removed from this flight without just cause." The captain looked as though he wanted to argue further, but Naomi's unyielding gaze stopped him. He straightened, clearly unsettled, and turned back toward the cockpit. Naomi exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the edge of her notebook. She glanced at the other passengers, many of whom quickly averted their eyes. But she caught a few sympathetic glances, a woman 2 rows behind her, a young man across the aisle. It was a small comfort in an otherwise isolating moment. Naomi reached for her phone. It was time to make a call. The weight of silence. The plane sat still, its engines humming faintly as if impatient to take off. Inside the first-class cabin, however, time seemed to slow. Naomi Bennett remained in her seat, her hands resting on her lap, steady despite the tension swirling around her. The whispers of passengers filled the otherwise quiet cabin, their curiosity barely veiled. She didn't need to turn around to know the looks she was getting. Some bewildered, some uncomfortable, and a few judgmental. The flight attendant, the younger one with nervous energy, approached again. She crouched slightly to meet Naomi at eye level, her voice soft and uncertain. "Ma'am," she began, hesitating as if searching for the right words. I just want to assure you that we're doing everything we can to resolve this." Naomi tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. The woman's face flushed, and she quickly looked down. "Resolve what exactly?" Naomi asked, her tone calm but firm. "As far as I can tell, I'm sitting in the seat I paid for, and the only disruption here seems to be caused by your pilot." The attendant swallowed hard. I'm not sure. I was just asked to check on you." Naomi nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't blame the attendant. She was just another cog in the machine, but that didn't make the situation any less infuriating. "Thank you," Naomi said curtly, dismissing her. As the attendant retreated, Naomi turned her gaze to the window. The tarmac stretched out like an endless gray expanse, dotted with the slow movements of other planes and ground crew. It was a stark contrast to the turbulence she felt brewing inside her. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen lit up, and her fingers hovered over a familiar number. Her husband, David Bennett, was a man known for his cool composure and unshakable resolve. He was her partner in every sense of the word, and she knew he would be livid once he heard what was happening. But calling him now would only escalate the situation. Naomi decided to wait, to see just how far they were willing to push her. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds paced back and forth, his mind racing. He had convinced himself he was acting on protocol, but deep down, a nagging doubt had begun to creep in. The look in Naomi's eyes when she had refused to leave her seat, that calm defiance, had shaken him in a way he didn't fully understand. "What's the delay, Captain?" the co-pilot asked, his tone cautious. Reynolds rubbed the back of his neck. "We might have a situation," he admitted. The co-pilot frowned. "A situation? With the passenger in 1A?" Reynolds nodded, avoiding his colleague's eyes. "I've asked her to step off the plane for additional verification, but she's refusing." The co-pilot leaned back in his seat, his expression skeptical. "Is there an actual issue, or are you just uncomfortable with her being here?" Reynolds shot him a sharp look. "This isn't about that." "Isn't it?" the co-pilot replied, his voice low. "Look, I don't know what you think she's done, but we can't delay this flight over nothing. Do you really want this to blow up in our faces?" Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, he stared out the small cockpit window, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had been a pilot for over 20 years, and he prided himself on his professionalism. But something about this woman had unsettled him, and he couldn't pinpoint why. Back in the cabin, Naomi's phone buzzed softly. She glanced at the screen. A message from David. "Everything okay? Your flight hasn't taken off yet." She typed a quick reply. "Delay. I'll explain later." As she set the phone down, the murmurs around her grew louder. A man seated across the aisle leaned toward his companion, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Why doesn't she just leave? It's not worth holding up the flight." His companion, a woman in her late 40s, shrugged. "Maybe she has something to hide." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath. She had spent her entire life navigating these unspoken accusations, the assumptions that came with her skin, her gender, her presence in spaces where she was often the only one who looked like her. But today, she was tired. Tired of the silence, tired of pretending it didn't bother her. She opened her eyes and turned to the man across the aisle. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. The man froze, his face reddening. "If you have something to say, feel free to say it to me directly." The man stammered, clearly caught off guard. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just wondering why this is taking so long." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Maybe because instead of doing his job, the captain has decided to single me out for reasons he has yet to explain." The man sank back into his seat, avoiding her gaze. Naomi turned away, her expression unreadable. She didn't enjoy confrontation, but she refused to let people talk about her as if she weren't there. Moments later, the flight attendant returned, her face pale. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, "the captain has requested your cooperation one last time. He's asking you to step off the plane." Naomi's patience finally snapped. She stood, her movements deliberate and controlled, and faced the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "I'd like to know if anyone here believes I've done something to warrant being removed from this plane." Silence fell over the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Naomi continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "Because as far as I can tell, the only thing I've done is sit in the seat I paid for. So if someone has a reason why I shouldn't be here, I'd love to hear it." Still, no one responded. Naomi turned back to the flight attendant, her eyes blazing. "Tell the captain I'm not leaving. If he has a problem with that, he can explain it to airport security." The flight attendant nodded quickly, retreating without another word. Naomi sat back down, her heart pounding. She had no idea how this would end, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to back down. A storm takes flight. The heavy silence in the first-class cabin was almost unbearable, yet Naomi Bennett sat with unshaken poise. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue across the tarmac. Inside, tension gripped the passengers and crew alike. Naomi remained calm outwardly, but inside, a quiet storm brewed. She was tired of being tested, tired of the silent accusations, and most of all, tired of the weight she had carried her entire life, simply for daring to exist unapologetically in spaces like this. Moments earlier, she had drawn the line. She refused to leave the plane despite the captain's repeated demands. It wasn't an act of defiance for its own sake. It was a stand for her dignity. And she was prepared for whatever fallout might come. The murmurs among the passengers had grown quieter, though she could still feel their eyes on her. Some were sympathetic. Others radiated discomfort. The air was thick with unspoken judgments, each one cutting deeper than words. Naomi straightened her back and glanced out the window again, grounding herself in the rhythmic motions of the airport outside. Suddenly, a new sound filled the cabin, the unmistakable thud of boots on the jet bridge. Naomi's stomach tightened. She didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. Seconds later, 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the entrance to the cabin. Their presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere from tense to electric. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Naomi's seat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we've been asked to escort you off the plane." Naomi met his gaze evenly, her expression betraying none of the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "And why is that?" she asked, her tone cool but edged with steel. The officer hesitated, glancing briefly at his partner. "The captain has expressed concerns and believes further verification is necessary." "Verification of what?" Naomi pressed. "I've already shown my boarding pass. I've followed every rule, complied with every request. What more do you need to verify?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. Naomi could see it, the same internal struggle she had witnessed so many times before. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to name the real reason for the captain's suspicion. Instead, he opted for the safety of protocol. "We're just following procedure, Mom." Naomi leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. "Procedure," she repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Tell me, officer, is it standard procedure to remove a paying passenger from a plane without cause? Or is this just for me?" The man's face tightened. "I'm asking you to cooperate, Mom. And I'm asking for an explanation," Naomi countered. "If you can't provide one, I suggest we bring someone who can." The officer exchanged a look with his partner, clearly unprepared for her resistance. Around them, the cabin was silent, the passengers frozen in a collective state of discomfort and intrigue. Naomi could feel their stares, but she refused to let them sway her. This moment wasn't about them. It was about her right to exist in this space without question. Finally, the officer sighed. "If you don't comply, we'll have to take further action." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And what action would that be?" "Dragging me off the plane in front of all these people. I'd love to see how that plays out." The officer hesitated again, clearly torn. His partner stepped forward, leaning down slightly to speak more quietly. "Ma'am, we're trying to avoid escalation. If you could just step off the plane, we can sort this out quickly and get you back on your way." Naomi tilted her head, studying him. "And how long will that take? Will it be quick enough for me to make my meeting in New York? Or will I be left stranded while you decide whether or not I deserve to be here?" The younger officer opened his mouth to respond but faltered. Naomi's words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. She had forced them into a corner. And they knew it. They had no legitimate reason to remove her, and the entire cabin was watching. "I'm not going anywhere," Naomi said, her voice unwavering. "If the captain has an issue with me, he can explain it himself." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unsure how to proceed. After a long, tense moment, the older officer straightened. "We'll be back," he said tersely before turning and walking away, his partner following close behind. Naomi watched them go, her jaw set in determination. She had won this round, but she knew the fight wasn't over. As the officers disappeared into the galley, she glanced around the cabin. Most passengers quickly averted their eyes, but a few looked at her with expressions that ranged from admiration to pity. One woman, seated across the aisle, leaned closer. She was in her early 60s, her graying hair pulled into an elegant bun, and her pearl earrings catching the dim cabin light. "That was brave," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Naomi turned to her, surprised. "Excuse me." "What you just did," the woman clarified. "Standing up for yourself like that. It's brave." Naomi studied her for a moment, unsure how to respond. Finally, she offered a faint smile. "Thank you," she said simply before turning back to the window. The minutes dragged on, and the tension in the cabin remained palpable. Naomi could feel her phone buzzing intermittently in her bag, likely her husband checking in. But she ignored it for now. She needed to stay focused. Suddenly, a new voice crackled over the intercom. It was the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're currently addressing an issue and appreciate your patience." Naomi rolled her eyes. An issue. That was one way to describe what was happening. Moments later, the captain himself appeared in the cabin again. His expression was tight, his jaw set. He walked directly to Naomi's seat, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low, "I'm giving you one last chance to step off this plane voluntarily." Naomi looked up at him, her face calm but her eyes blazing with determination. "And I'm giving you one last chance to explain why I should." The captain's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "You're disrupting the flight." Naomi let out a short laugh. "I'm disrupting the flight. I'm sitting in my seat, quietly waiting for takeoff. You're the one who stopped the plane." The captain's jaw tightened further. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to cancel the flight entirely." The threat hung in the air, shocking the nearby passengers into stunned silence. Naomi held his gaze, unflinching. "Then cancel it," she said evenly. "But know that when you do, every single person on this plane will know exactly why." The captain blinked, clearly caught off guard. Naomi's calm defiance was unlike anything he had expected. He glanced around the cabin, seeing the curious and judgmental eyes of his passengers. The power he had relied on to intimidate her was slipping through his fingers. And he knew it. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the cockpit. Naomi exhaled slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much larger. A fight she hadn't asked for, but could no longer avoid. And whatever came next, she would be ready. The private jet lands. The stillness inside the cabin felt suffocating, as if the weight of the unfolding confrontation was pressing down on everyone at once. Naomi Bennett sat upright, her chin held high, refusing to waver under the mounting pressure. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their murmurs a quiet backdrop to her own steady breathing. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of airport announcements seeped through the plane's walls, almost mocking in their mundanity compared to the tension inside. Minutes passed, then stretched into what felt like an eternity. Naomi's phone buzzed in her bag again, but she ignored it. Instead, she glanced at her watch. The flight was now 30 minutes behind schedule. The cabin crew hovered nervously near the galley, exchanging glances but doing nothing. Naomi could tell they didn't know how to handle this situation, or her. Their silence spoke volumes. She reached for her water bottle, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she unscrewed the cap. As calm as she appeared on the outside, Naomi wasn't immune to the stress of the moment. She was human after all. But she had learned long ago how to channel that stress, to turn it into fuel. Taking a slow sip, she focused on grounding herself. She couldn't afford to lose her composure now, not when the stakes were this high. Suddenly, there was movement at the front of the plane. The cabin door opened, and a new figure stepped inside. A man in an impeccably tailored gray suit, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. He was tall, with a commanding presence that drew every eye in the room. Naomi recognized him immediately. David Bennett. Her husband's arrival sent a ripple through her chest, a mix of relief and anticipation. He moved with purpose, his face unreadable as he scanned the cabin. When his eyes landed on Naomi, his expression softened just slightly, but there was no mistaking the steely resolve in his gaze. He strode toward her, his steps measured and deliberate, and for a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. "Naomi," he said, his voice low but filled with warmth. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice wavered just enough to betray the strain she was under. "But they're trying to remove me without cause." David nodded, his jaw tightening. "I've already spoken to the airline's legal team," he said. "They're aware of what's happening. Let's see how this plays out." Before Naomi could respond, another figure entered the cabin, a representative from the airline, her name tag reading Margaret Wynne. She was a petite woman with sharp features, her hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her smile was polished, but her eyes betrayed her nervousness as she approached David and Naomi. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett," Margaret began, her tone overly saccharine. "I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience. We're working to resolve this as quickly as possible." David turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Inconvenience," he repeated, his voice cold. "Is that what we're calling this now?" Margaret hesitated, clearly unprepared for his directness. I understand your frustration," she stammered. "But the captain—" David cut her off. "The captain has made baseless accusations against my wife and delayed this flight for no reason. That's not frustration, Ms. Wynne. That's a violation." Margaret's face flushed, and she glanced nervously at the surrounding passengers, who were now openly watching the exchange. "We're taking this matter very seriously," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "I assure you—" "I don't need your assurances," David said, his tone cutting. "I need you to explain why my wife was singled out in the first place." Naomi watched as Margaret faltered, her carefully rehearsed responses crumbling under David's scrutiny. She had seen her husband in action many times before, in the courtroom, in boardrooms, but there was something different about this. He wasn't just defending a client or negotiating a deal. He was fighting for her, and that made him relentless. Before Margaret could stammer out another excuse, the sound of engines roaring outside caught everyone's attention. Naomi turned her head toward the window, her brows furrowing as she spotted a sleek black private jet taxiing toward their plane. The jet gleamed under the setting sun, its polished exterior reflecting the surrounding tarmac. Naomi's confusion deepened as the jet came to a stop a short distance away. "What's that?" she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. David's lips twitched into a faint smile. "That," he said, "is your new ride." Naomi blinked, her eyes widening as realization dawned. "You didn't." David shrugged, his tone nonchalant but laced with satisfaction. "I made a few calls." The private jet's door opened, and a set of stairs unfolded smoothly onto the tarmac. A sharply dressed attendant emerged, standing at the base of the steps and scanning the area. Within moments, another figure appeared, David's longtime friend and business partner, Charles Harris. He waved toward the first-class cabin, a knowing smirk on his face. Naomi turned to David, her expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You called Charles." "He offered," David replied simply. "Said he couldn't stand the thought of you being treated like this." The cabin fell silent as the realization of what was happening spread among the passengers. Naomi stood slowly, her movements deliberate, as she turned back to Margaret. "I'll be leaving now," she said, her voice calm but filled with unmistakable authority. "But not because your captain asked me to. I'm leaving because I have better places to be." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Naomi didn't wait for her to recover. She took David's hand, and together they walked down the aisle, past the stunned faces of the passengers and crew. Naomi kept her head high, her heels clicking against the floor like a drumbeat of triumph. As they stepped onto the tarmac, the cool evening air washed over her, carrying away the tension that had clung to her for hours. She looked up at the private jet, its sleek lines a symbol of the power she had fought so hard to claim. And as she ascended the steps, hand in hand with David, she couldn't help but smile. This was her moment, not just a victory, but a reminder of who she was and what she deserved. And as the jet's door closed behind her and the engines roared to life, she knew this was only the beginning. The sky is not the limit. The private jet ascended smoothly into the golden evening sky, leaving behind the turmoil of the airport far below. Naomi Bennett gazed out of the large tinted window, her reflection a portrait of calm strength. She leaned back into the plush leather seat, the quiet hum of the engines a stark contrast to the tension she had endured moments earlier. The luxury of the jet was undeniable, its interior all soft creams and polished wood, with gold accents glinting in the warm ambient lighting. But for Naomi, the true luxury was not the setting. It was the freedom, the undeniable reclamation of her dignity. Across from her, David sat with his phone in hand, his brow furrowed as he typed out an email with precision. His calm exterior was a facade she knew well. Underneath, his mind was racing. He glanced up briefly, catching her eye. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Naomi let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Better now," she admitted, though the weight of the day still lingered. "Thank you for this." David gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. You should never have been put in that position to begin with." Naomi nodded, her gaze drifting back to the window. Below, the sprawling city lights twinkled like stars scattered across the earth, a beautiful but distant reminder of the chaos she had left behind. Yet, even as she tried to let herself relax, her thoughts churned. The captain's actions, the murmurs of the passengers, the hesitant apologies of the flight crew. It all replayed in her mind, each moment a stinging reminder of the biases she had spent her life confronting. David's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Charles says the press is already picking up the story," he said, his tone neutral but with an edge of curiosity. Naomi turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "The press?" David nodded, holding up his phone so she could see the notifications flooding his screen. Headlines flashed across the display. "Businesswoman removed from first-class flight. Airline under fire. Corporate bias in the sky. How one woman fought back. Passenger standoff grounds flight. What really happened?" Naomi felt her stomach twist. She had known the incident would draw attention. It was impossible for something so public not to. But seeing it laid out in black and white, the narrative already spiraling beyond her control, was unnerving. "I didn't want this to become a spectacle," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather armrest. David leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Naomi, this isn't just about you. This is about everyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong. You stood up for yourself, and now people are paying attention. That matters." Naomi studied his face, the conviction in his eyes. She wanted to believe him, but part of her couldn't help but wonder if this would truly lead to change, or if it would become just another story buried under the weight of a 24-hour news cycle. The jet's attendant appeared then, her demeanor professional but warm. "Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Bennett, can I get you anything?" she asked, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Naomi shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you." The attendant nodded and disappeared back into the cabin, leaving Naomi and David alone once more. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, charged with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Naomi broke the silence. "Do you think they'll actually do anything?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. David frowned slightly. "The airline. They'll make a statement, suspend the captain, maybe roll out some new training programs. It'll look good on paper, but whether it changes anything, that's harder to say." Naomi sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. "It's not enough." David reached across the small table between them, taking her hand in his. "Then make it enough," he said simply. She looked at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" I mean, David said, leaning forward, you have a platform now. People are listening. You can use this moment to push for real accountability, not just for this airline, but for the industry as a whole. Naomi hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. She had spent her entire career advocating for herself in boardrooms, proving her worth over and over again. But this was something bigger. The thought both excited and terrified her. Before she could respond, David's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and sighed. It's Margaret Wynne, he said. She wants to set up a meeting with their board tomorrow morning. Naomi's jaw tightened. Of course she does. David studied her carefully. What do you want to do? Naomi was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She thought about the passengers who had whispered about her, the captain who had wielded his authority like a weapon, and the countless others who had faced similar treatment without the resources or support to fight back. This wasn't just her fight, it was theirs too. I'll meet with them, she said finally, her voice firm. But it's going to be on my terms. David nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. I wouldn't expect anything less. Naomi returned his smile, though it was fleeting. She knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. But as the jet soared through the darkening sky, she felt a sense of purpose settle over her. For too long, she had been content to quietly navigate the barriers placed in her path. Now she was ready to break through them. The flight continued smoothly, the jet slicing through the night like a blade. Naomi eventually dozed off, her head resting against the window. When she awoke, the city lights of New York stretched out below her, a dazzling tapestry of possibility. As the jet descended toward the private terminal, she felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Naomi Bennett wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. The ripple effect. The jet touched down smoothly at the private terminal, the soft rumble of its wheels on the tarmac pulling Naomi Bennett from her thoughts. She looked out the window at the glittering skyline of New York City, its towering buildings standing as silent witnesses to her arrival. The private jet was a symbol of triumph, but Naomi wasn't celebrating yet. Her mind was already focused on the meeting ahead, a meeting that could set the tone for how the world would view what had happened. As the jet taxied to a halt, the attendant reappeared, her demeanor professional yet kind. Mrs. Bennett, we've arranged for a car to take you and Mr. Bennett to your hotel. Is there anything else I can assist you with? Naomi offered a small smile. No, thank you. That'll be all. The door opened, and the brisk New York air rushed in. Naomi stepped out onto the stairs, her heels clicking against the metal as she descended. At the bottom of the steps, a sleek black car waited, its driver standing by with the door open. David followed close behind, his presence a steadying force. Ready? He asked as they slid into the car. Naomi took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the moment settle over her. As I'll ever be. The drive to their hotel was brief but felt endless. Naomi stared out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow. Her phone buzzed constantly in her lap. Messages, calls, notifications, but she ignored them for now. She needed clarity, and the noise of the outside world threatened to drown it out. When they arrived at the hotel, they were greeted by a flurry of staff eager to assist. Naomi moved through the lobby with quiet grace, her heels tapping a steady rhythm against the marble floor. Once inside their suite, she sank into an armchair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. David set his briefcase on the desk and pulled up a chair across from her. The board meeting is at 10 a.m. tomorrow, he said, his tone calm but purposeful. We'll have time to prepare. Naomi nodded, her eyes drifting to the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering cityscape. This isn't just about the airline anymore, she said softly. David leaned forward, his hands clasped together. No, it's not. But that's why it matters. What happened on that plane? It's a reflection of something much bigger, and you have the chance to shine a light on it. Naomi looked at him, her brow furrowed. Do you think it'll make a difference? One meeting, one statement. Can it really change anything? David's gaze was steady. It won't fix everything, but it's a start. And sometimes that's all it takes to create a ripple. The next morning, Naomi arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters with David by her side. The building was a towering structure of glass and steel, its modern design exuding power and authority. But Naomi wasn't intimidated. She had walked into countless rooms like this before, and she knew how to hold her ground. Inside, they were greeted by Margaret Wynne, the airline representative Naomi had confronted on the plane. Margaret's demeanor was more subdued now, her polished smile barely masking the tension beneath. "Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice overly polite. "Thank you for coming. The board is waiting for you." Naomi nodded but said nothing, her expression unreadable. She followed Margaret down a long corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. They arrived at a large conference room, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city. Inside, the airline's board members sat around a sleek table, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and forced professionalism. "Mrs. Bennett," one of the board members said as she entered, rising slightly from his seat. "Thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat." Naomi took her place at the table, David sitting to her right. She scanned the room, taking in the faces of the people who held the power to make decisions, but who had, until now, failed to wield that power responsibly. The silence in the room was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. "Let's begin," Naomi said, her voice calm but commanding. "I want to make something clear. This isn't about an apology. It's about accountability." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The man who had greeted her cleared his throat. "Of course," he said. "We take this matter very seriously, and we've already begun implementing measures to ensure something like this doesn't happen again." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Measures like what?" "Mandatory sensitivity training for all staff." Another board member chimed in. "A thorough review of our internal policies." Naomi held up a hand, cutting him off. "That's a start," she said, her tone sharp. "But it's not enough. This isn't just about policies or training. It's about culture. It's about the biases that allowed your captain to single me out in the first place, and the passengers who felt emboldened to judge me without knowing a thing about me." The room fell silent. Naomi's words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "If you're serious about change, you need to go beyond surface-level fixes. You need to ask the hard questions. Who are you hiring? Who are you promoting? What message are you sending to your employees and to your passengers about who belongs in your spaces?" The board members shifted uncomfortably, but none of them dared to interrupt. Naomi continued, her voice gaining momentum. "I'm not here to ask for compensation or empty promises. I'm here to demand real systemic change, and I'll be watching to make sure it happens." Margaret Wynne, seated near the end of the table, spoke up hesitantly. "Mrs. Bennett, we deeply regret what happened to you, and we're committed to—" "This isn't just about me," Naomi interjected, her voice firm. "This is about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. And if you think a few training sessions will fix that, you're mistaken." The room was silent once more, the weight of Naomi's words sinking in. She could see the discomfort in their faces, but she could also see something else. The faint flicker of understanding, the realization that this was bigger than they had anticipated. David placed a hand on Naomi's arm, a silent gesture of support. She glanced at him briefly before turning back to the board. "The world is watching," she said simply. "Don't let this be another empty promise." With that, she rose from her seat, signaling that the meeting was over. The board members scrambled to their feet, offering hurried assurances and polite farewells, but Naomi didn't linger. She walked out of the room with David by her side, her head held high. Later that evening, as Naomi stood by the window of their hotel suite, watching the city lights blink against the dark sky, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a stranger, a woman who had read about the incident online. "Thank you," the message read, "for standing up, for being brave. You've inspired me." Naomi stared at the words for a long moment, her chest tightening. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. The ripple had begun. She turned to David, who was seated on the couch, his laptop open in front of him. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" she asked softly. David looked up, his expression steady. "It already has." Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't stop fighting. Not for herself, and not for the countless others who needed her to keep pushing forward. The sky wasn't the limit. It never had been. Naomi turned back to the window, the glow of the city below reflecting in her eyes. The message from the stranger lingered in her thoughts, its simplicity giving it power. It wasn't the first time someone had thanked her for standing up, but this moment felt different, more significant. The story of what had happened on that plane was no longer hers alone. It had become a rallying cry for those who had been overlooked, dismissed, and judged. She paced the room, her heels tapping softly against the hardwood floor, her thoughts racing. Tomorrow, the media would undoubtedly analyze every word she had spoken during the board meeting. Pundits would dissect the event, opinions would clash, and the airline would be forced to respond under the pressure of public scrutiny. She knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. David's voice broke the quiet. "Naomi," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Come sit down. You've done enough for today." She turned to him, her expression conflicted. "Have I?" she asked. "I spoke to the board, yes. I made my demands clear. But what if they don't follow through? What if this becomes just another story that fades into the background?" David stood, crossing the room to stand in front of her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, grounding her. "They can't ignore you, Naomi. Not now. You've done something bigger than you realize. People are paying attention because of you." She searched his face, finding the reassurance she didn't know she needed. I don't want this to be meaningless," she said softly. David smiled, a small, knowing curve of his lips. "It's not meaningless. The world isn't changed by one act, Naomi. It's changed by persistence, by refusing to let things stay the way they are. And if anyone knows how to be persistent, it's you." Naomi let out a soft laugh, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "I suppose you're right." David chuckled, pulling her into an embrace. "I'm always right." She rolled her eyes, but her smile lingered as she leaned into him, drawing comfort from his warmth. For a moment, the world outside faded away, leaving only the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. The next morning, Naomi woke to a flurry of notifications on her phone. The story had gone viral. News outlets across the country were covering it, and social media was ablaze with hashtags like #StandWithNaomi and #EqualSeats. Messages poured in, some supportive, some critical, but all proof that her actions had struck a chord. David handed her a cup of coffee as she scrolled through the headlines. One in particular caught her eye: the passenger who refused to be grounded. How Naomi Bennett sparked a movement. The article detailed her confrontation with the airline, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing fight against systemic bias. It quoted statements from passengers who had witnessed the incident, many of whom expressed admiration for her courage. Naomi set her phone down, her emotions a mix of pride and unease. "It's strange," she admitted, "being at the center of all this." David sat beside her, his own coffee in hand. "You didn't ask for it, but you're handling it with grace. That's what people admire about you." She nodded slowly, her thoughts shifting to what lay ahead. The airline had promised to release a public statement that afternoon, and she knew the world would be watching. But for Naomi, this was about more than an apology. It was about ensuring that no one else had to endure what she had. By midday, the airline's statement was released. It acknowledged the incident, apologized to Naomi, and outlined several initiatives they claimed would address the systemic issues within their organization. These included mandatory training programs, increased diversity in hiring practices, and the establishment of a passenger advocacy board to handle complaints more effectively. The response was mixed. While some applauded the measures, others criticized the airline for not going far enough. Naomi herself wasn't satisfied, but she saw the statement as a starting point, a crack in the facade of complacency that had allowed such incidents to persist. Later that evening, Naomi appeared on a nationally televised news program to discuss the event. Sitting across from the host, she spoke with clarity and conviction, her words resonating with millions of viewers. "This isn't about one flight or one airline," she said, her gaze steady. "It's about a culture that too often treats people like me as if we don't belong. That has to change, not just in the skies, but everywhere, and it's going to take all of us to make it happen." The interview went viral within hours, sparking conversations across the country. Naomi's story became a symbol of resistance and resilience, inspiring others to share their own experiences and demand change in their own industries and communities. Weeks later, Naomi sat in her office, reviewing a proposal for a new initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for equitable treatment in transportation and travel. David had encouraged her to pursue the idea, and as she worked on the details, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up to see another message from a stranger. This one read, "Because of you, I spoke up at work today. Thank you for giving me the courage." Naomi smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. She had set out to change one moment of injustice, but the ripple effect had grown far beyond what she could have imagined. The sky, it turned out, was not the limit. It was just the beginning.